The laughter started at 9:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night in the parking lot of a Kroger on Veterans Memorial Parkway in Augusta, Georgia, and it lasted for 11 seconds. She counted them. She was standing at the trunk of her 2019 silver Honda Accord with two grocery bags at her feet and her military identification card in her right hand, which the officer had just handed back to her after holding it under his flashlight for 30 seconds, tilting it left, tilting it right, and then holding it out to his partner with a particular motion, a small sideways flick of the wrist, the flick you use when you are passing someone a joke rather than a document. His partner took it, looked at her, then at the card again. Then he laughed, and the first officer laughed. And the third one, who had been standing 6 feet back with his arms folded, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same house as one. She did not move. She did not speak. She stood with her hands at her sides and her face arranged in the expression of a person who is collecting information rather than reacting to it. And she let the 11 seconds happen the way you let weather happen. You do not argue with weather. You note it, you record it, and you decide what it requires of you. What the laughter was about, according to the first officer, was the title on the card. He said it out loud, still smiling. Colonel. He said it the way a person says a word they do not believe applies to the object in their hand. She said nothing. He sighed. You were speeding, ma'am. 49 in a 35. He said ma'am the same way he had said colonel. She said, I understand. She did not explain. She did not correct him. She took her card back when he held it out, put it in her wallet, put her wallet in her bag, and waited for the ticket, which he wrote slowly and tore from the pad and handed to her without making eye contact. She placed the ticket in the center console of the Accord and drove home. She pulled into the driveway of her house on Wheeler Road at 10:09 p.m. She sat in the car for 4 minutes with the engine off. Then she took out her phone and dialed a number she had not dialed in 6 months. And when the person on the other end answered, she said, I need you to tell me what the reporting procedure is. I want to do this correctly. What she meant by correctly would take 3 officers, 1 inspector general's office, 1 congressional inquiry, and 14 weeks to understand fully. But it started there, in the driveway on Wheeler Road, at 10:13 p.m. on a Wednesday, with a ticket for 49 in a 35 that was never going to be about the speed. Her name was Colonel Nkechi Adeyemi, and she was 52 years old, 5 feet 6, 148 pounds, and she had been serving in the United States Army for 27 years, the last 4 of them as a full colonel assigned to the United States Army Cyber Command at Fort Eisenhower, which sat 9 miles north of the Kroger on Veterans Memorial Parkway. She had been on her way home from a late session reviewing contractor deliverables when she stopped for groceries because she had run out of the specific brand of ground pepper her mother had taught her to use, and she had a call with her sister in Enugu on Thursday morning, and she did not like to be on the phone without something warm in her hands. She drove a silver Accord because she had been driving silver Accords since 2003 and found no compelling reason to change. The car before this one had 189,000 miles on it when she sold it. She had kept it clean and serviced according to the manufacturer's schedule because that was how she maintained everything in her life. According to schedule, according to standard, without drama. She was wearing her civilian clothes because she had changed before leaving the office. A dark blue blazer over a cream blouse, dark trousers, low-heeled black shoes she had bought from a DSW on Washington Road for $38 in the spring. She had been wearing the blazer since March because it had the particular useful quality of looking both professional and nondescript, which was most days exactly what she needed it to be. The blouse had been ironed that morning at 5:45 a.m., the way she ironed everything, carefully, moving from collar to cuffs, because her mother had said that presentation was the first argument you made before anyone had decided to listen to you. The blazer still smelled faintly of the cedar candles she kept on her home office desk. She had bought 6 of them from a small shop on Broad Street in August because the smell helped her concentrate at night, and she had been doing a great deal of night work lately. Contractor deliverables had been running 6 weeks behind schedule, and she had been pulling late hours since September to close the gap. In the glove compartment of the Accord, underneath the vehicle registration and the insurance card in their plastic sleeve, was a small frame photograph, 3 inches by 4, of her mother standing in front of their house in Enugu in 1987 with her hands on her hips and a look on her face that said she had recently made a decision and was comfortable with it. Nkechi had carried this photograph in every vehicle she had owned since 2001. It was not decorative. It was reference material. When she needed to remember what composure under pressure looked like, she opened the glove compartment. She had not opened it tonight. She had not needed to. Her skill, the one that appeared on no performance review in language that captured it fully, was institutional architecture. She understood how large organizations moved, where their pressure points were, how accountability traveled or failed to travel through chains of command, and precisely which lever, pulled at which point, produced which outcome. She had spent 27 years inside one of the largest institutions in the world, and she knew its structure the way a master carpenter knows the grain of a familiar wood. Not theoretically, but in the hands. She had identified in 11 seconds of laughter in a parking lot on Veterans Memorial Parkway exactly which lever she intended to pull. The Augusta Richmond County Sheriff's Office had 162 sworn officers as of October of that year. Its Internal Affairs Division had received 37 complaints in the previous 18 months, of which 6 had resulted in disciplinary action. The 3 officers in the Kroger parking lot were assigned to the evening patrol district that covered the Fort Eisenhower corridor, which meant that on any given night they drove past the front gate of a United States Army installation multiple times per shift, past the sign that listed the installation's name, past the uniformed soldiers who came and went from it, and had arrived nonetheless at a point of view about the likelihood of the woman at the trunk of the Silver Accord being what her identification card said she was. The first officer's name tag said Teller. He was 31, 7 years on the force, with 2 prior complaints in his file, 1 resolved, 1 pending from 11 months ago. The second officer, the one who had laughed first and hardest, was named Cole. He was 28, 4 years in, no prior complaints. The third officer, Marsh, was 44, 16 years on the force. The one whose sound had not quite been a laugh but had lived adjacent to it. Marsh had been the senior officer at the scene. This detail mattered more than Marsh had understood while it was happening. In the 14 weeks that followed, it would matter more than almost any other detail in the file. Nonkechi had noted all 3 names before she put her ID back in her wallet. She had noted them the way she noted everything in a briefing room. Efficiently, completely, without making it visible that she was doing so. The procedure she had asked about on the phone in her driveway, the correct procedure, was a formal complaint filed simultaneously with 3 offices: the Sheriff's Office Internal Affairs Division, the Army Garrison Commander at Fort Eisenhower, and the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. The simultaneity was the mechanism. A complaint filed with one office could be managed by that office at that office's pace and in that office's interest. A complaint filed with 3 simultaneously, particularly when one of them sat inside the chain of command of a federal military installation 9 miles from the scene of the incident, produced a different kind of motion. She typed the complaint herself. She sat at the desk in her home office on Wheeler Road, a room that contained 2 bookshelves, a framed copy of the Army Values poster, a photograph of her commissioning in 1997, and a second photograph of her with her mother taken at her promotion ceremony to lieutenant colonel in 2016. At her mother's hand on her shoulder and the same expression on her face she had in the 1987 photo, the look of a woman who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. And she typed for 41 minutes. The complaint was 6 pages. It described the stop in precise language, the duration of each exchange, the exact words spoken, the 11 seconds of laughter, the name tags she had observed, the tone in which Colonel had been said. She filed it at 11:58 p.m. If this story is already settling somewhere in your chest, stay with me. Because what happens when that filing hits 3 desks simultaneously is not what any of the 3 officers on Veterans Memorial Parkway were prepared for. She went to bed at 12 or 7 a.m. She set her alarm for 5:15. She slept. The Augusta Richmond County Sheriff's Office received the complaint at 11:58 p.m., and it landed in the Internal Affairs queue, where it sat until the following morning. The EI division did not operate 24-hour intake review. Complaints filed after business hours were logged, time-stamped, and held for the next available investigator. Under ordinary circumstances, this complaint would have been read Monday at approximately 8:30 a.m. by a junior investigator who would have categorized it, assigned it a case number, and moved it up the chain at the pace the chain was currently moving, which, based on the 18-month backlog, was not fast. But the copy sent to the Fort Eisenhower Garrison commander was read by the commander's executive officer at 6:44 a.m. Thursday, flagged as a priority matter involving a field-grade officer currently assigned to Army Cyber Command, and walked into the commander's office at 7:02 a.m. The garrison commander placed the call to the Richmond County Sheriff at 7:31 a.m. The sheriff, who had not yet seen the complaint himself, received this information in the specific way that a senior law enforcement official receives information about a complaint involving personnel from a federal installation, with the close attention of a man who understands, immediately and completely, what kind of problem he is now managing. He called his Internal Affairs Division Chief at 7:43 a.m. The EI chief pulled the files on Teller, Coley, and Marsh before 8 a.m. Teller's pending complaint from 11 months ago concerned a nearly identical stop, a black professional woman, civilian vehicle, residencial adjacent context. Conduct during the stop described as dismissive and demeaning. The complaint had been categorized as unresolved, which in the language of that office meant it had not been formally closed but had also not been formally pursued. It sat in a file. It did not sit in a file any longer. The EI division chief called his investigator at 8:11 a.m. and used the word expedited. What the EI division chief did not say, and what the investigator understood anyway from the sequence of calls that had already reached her desk before 9 a.m., was that the complaint had arrived with its own momentum. She had worked in internal affairs for 6 years. She knew the difference between a complaint that would be managed and a complaint that had already escaped management. This one had already escaped. The Fort Eisenhower call had made that permanent. The IG filing had made it federal. There was no version of the next 14 weeks in which this complaint could be quietly resolved at the departmental level, absorbed into the backlog, categorized as unresolved, and left to sit the way Teller's prior complaint had sat for 11 months. She pulled that prior complaint herself at 8:47 a.m. and read it in full for the first time. It had been filed by a woman named Grace Owusu-Boateng, a 44-year-old accountant, stopped in the summer of the previous year near the Regency Mall on Wrightsboro Road. The stop had lasted 23 minutes. The language in her complaint described conduct during the stop as dismissive and demeaning, and named Teller specifically. The complaint had been received, categorized, and assigned a case number. It had never been assigned an investigator. The investigator placed it in the file next to Nketch's complaint. Then she made a phone call to Grace Owusu-Boateng, who answered on the third ring. The copy sent to the day-over-day Inspector General's office moved on a different track at a different velocity. It entered a system that had its own gravity, its own timeline, its own logic entirely separate from what was happening in the sheriff's office on Thursday morning. An IG complaint involving a corno, a military identification card, and 3 law enforcement officers in a jurisdiction adjacent to a federal installation was a document with specific weight. The EG's office had a liaison function with congressional oversight committees. These were not dramatic mechanisms. They were procedural, applied correctly, produced outcomes. Nomkechi went to work on Thursday morning at 7:20 a.m. She drove the Silver Accord down Wheeler Road and onto Gordon Highway, and across the bridge and through the Fort Eisenhower Gate. And she swiped her access badge, and she went to her office and opened her laptop, and she reviewed the contractor deliverables she had not finished the night before. And she attended 3 meetings. And she ate a lunch she had packed that morning at her desk, jollof rice in a glass container still warm. And she answered 14 emails. She did not discuss the complaint with colleagues. She did not tell the story at lunch. She did not perform what had happened in the parking lot. She had filed a complaint in the correct format with the correct offices, and the mechanism was now in motion. And her contribution to it had been made. What remained was her job, and she did it. The woman who had been watching from a car 2 spaces down in the Kroger parking lot on Wednesday night was named Blessing Okafor. She was 39, a civilian contractor who worked in a different building at Fort Eisenhower, and she had been sitting in her car eating a protein bar and finishing a work call when the stop happened in her sight line. She had not planned to be a witness. She had not planned to be anything except someone eating a protein bar in a parking lot at 9:44 p.m. But she had watched, and she had seen the flashlight, and the card, and the flick of the wrist, and the 11 seconds of laughter, and she had noted the name tags. She could not see Marsh's from her angle, but she had Teller and Cole clearly, and she had written them in the Notes app on her phone before the officers got back in their cruiser. The way a person does when they understand they have seen something that may need to be reported and does not know yet who to report it to. She found out who to report it to on Friday morning, when a colleague mentioned that there was a complaint going through EA involving a colonel from Cyber Command and a traffic stop on Vets Parkway Wednesday night. Blessing sat with that for 45 minutes. Then she walked to the office of the Fort Eisenhower Legal Assistance Office and asked to speak to someone about making a witness statement. The statement was 3 pages. It corroborated every detail of the timeline. It included the specific sound Blessing had described as a sound not of surprise, but of recognition. The kind of laugh that says, "We know what this is." The laugh of people in agreement about something they have not spoken aloud. The investigator received Blessing's statement on Friday afternoon. She read it twice. She placed it in the file next to Nkechi's complaint. She noted the corroboration of the 11 seconds and the wrist flick and the way the word colonel had been said. She wrote one word in her notes: sustained. The formal findings arrived in 8 weeks, not the projected 14, because the I investigation ran concurrently with the day-over-day IG review, and the timelines compressed each other. The findings cited all 3 officers: Teller for the conduct of the stop and its connection to the prior unresolved complaint, establishing a pattern; Cole for the laugh, which the investigative report described in language that was precise and institutional and carried no emotion but whose meaning was unmistakable; Marsh for failure of supervisory responsibility, which was the charge that had the most weight in his 16-year record and the most consequence for his rank. Teller resigned before the disciplinary board convened. Cole was terminated. Marsh, and this was the finding that took the longest and meant the most, was stripped of his supervisory designation and placed on final warning status, which in practical terms ended his advancement in the department and began a clock that most people in his position do not outlast. 3 careers, not ended in a single dramatic moment, ended by a 6-page filing at 11:58 p.m. on a Wednesday night, by a woman who had sat in her driveway for 4 minutes and then picked up the phone and asked to do things correctly. The Congressional Oversight Committee sent a letter to the sheriff requesting information about the department's training protocols for law enforcement interactions with military personnel. The letter was not public. It did not need to be public. Letters from oversight committees to municipal law enforcement offices have their own gravity. They produce motion. Blessing Okafor, whose name appeared nowhere in the news coverage because the EAA process was internal, and the press release the sheriff's office issued referred only to administrative actions arising from a complaint, without naming the complainant or the witness, received a brief email from Nkechi on the day the findings were released. The email said, "Your statement was the corroboration. Thank you for sitting in that parking lot on Wednesday night." Blessing read the email at her desk in her office at Fort Eisenhower. She read it 3 times. She saved it to a folder she kept for things she wanted to remember, a folder that had 9 items in it. Most of them emails, all of them, from moments when she had done something uncomfortable and had not known until later whether it had mattered. Now she knew. There is a particular category of disbelief that is not ignorance. Ignorance can be corrected with information. This other thing, the thing that looked at a military identification card belonging to a colonel with 27 years of service and tilted it left and tilted it right, and then passed it to a colleague with a flick of the wrist. This is something that already has the information and has chosen, somewhere below the level of conscious decision, not to apply it. The card was real. The rank was real. The 27 years were real. The disbelief happened anyway, in 11 seconds, with sound. The world does not always know what it is standing in the presence of, but there is a specific version of this that is not innocent. The version where all the information is available and the decision is made to set it aside. Because the surface of the person does not match the category the mind has already built for that surface. A woman, a silver Accord, dark blue blazer, dark trousers, 49 in a 35 on Veterans Memorial Parkway. These were the facts available to Officer Teller, a colonel with 27 years of service and a clearance level that was not printed on the ID card. These were also the facts. The second set arrived in his hand, and he passed it sideways like a joke. That passing, that flick of the wrist, that was the moment. Not the 11 seconds of laughter that followed. Those were the consequence. The moment was the motion of a man deciding, in one gesture, that the document in his hand could not mean what it said. Nkechi Adeyemi went to work on Monday after the findings were released. She drove the silver Accord through the Fort Eisenhower gate, swiped her access badge, went to her office, opened her laptop. She attended 4 meetings. She ate her lunch at her desk. She answered 17 emails. On her lunch break, she called her mother in Enugu. It was evening there. Her mother asked how things were. Nkechi said things were fine. Her mother asked if she was eating. She said yes, she had brought food. Her mother said good, because a person who does not eat cannot think, and a person who cannot think is not useful to anyone. Nkechi sighed, "You are right." Her mother said she was always right, and said goodnight, and hung up. Nkechi finished her lunch and went back to her contractor deliverables. In the afternoon, moved the way afternoons move when the necessary work has been done, and the remaining work is simply work. One task, then the next, in the particular quiet of a person who is not waiting for anything because everything that needed to happen has already been set in motion. You cannot mock what a person has earned and expect the record to stay quiet. The record never stays quiet. It was filed in the correct format with the correct offices, and it moved at its own velocity. And the velocity was sufficient, and when it arrived completely. 27 years of service has its own weight. A 6-page document, filed at 11:58 p.m., carries that weight. What you do in a parking lot on a Wednesday night is not private. It is a document waiting to be written. The wrist flicked took less than 1 second. The response to it took 14 weeks. That ratio, 1 second of dismissal, 14 weeks of consequence, is not unusual. It is, in fact, the exact ratio by which most forms of this disbelief are eventually corrected. Not with speed, not with drama, but with the patient, correct application of procedure by someone who knows exactly which lever to pull. Nkechi Adeyemi had known since the 11th second. She had waited 4 minutes in her driveway. Then she had acted. That is the full story. And the full story is not about the laughter. The laughter is the beginning. The story is about what a woman does after the laughter stops and the car doors close, and the cruiser pulls out of the Kroger parking lot, and she is standing alone at the trunk of her silver Accord, with 2 grocery bags at her feet and 27 years in her chest. She picks up the bags, she puts them in the trunk, she closes the trunk, she gets in the car. She drives home, carefully at the speed limit the whole way. Here is the question I want you to sit with. If someone dismissed something you had spent decades building, not to your face but in a gesture, a laugh, a flick of the wrist, would you have the patience to respond correctly rather than immediately? And what would correctly mean to you? In that moment, in that driveway? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.